In the landmark decision, Terry v. Ohio, the United States Supreme Court gave us the legal requirements of what would become known as the Terry Frisk. However, as a former prosecutor, I've seen officers make several mistakes when it comes to a Terry Frisk. So in this episode of the podcast, we're getting back down to the basics. I'm going to explain and break down the legal requirements of a Terry Frisk and talk about a couple of cases that every officer must know right now. What's up, everybody? I'm attorney Eric Scramlin, and this is the Tactical In-Service Podcast, a podcast for law enforcement where I break down training topics and case law to help you, the law enforcement community, stay up on the law. Today, I'm going to be breaking down the very basics, the legal requirements of a Terry Frisk. But before I get started, if I can ask you all to do a favor, if you're listening to the podcast, follow it. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. I got a lot of information to cover here today. I'm probably not going to get to it all, so it's likely there'll be a part 2. Hit subscribe so you can get notified when I get a chance to come out with that video. All right, let's break down Terry Frisks. As a former prosecutor, this is basic stuff, but it's remarkable that there's little things that we can forget, the basics. Got to get down to the basics and understand what you can, what you can't do as a police officer. Before I even dive into this, if you haven't seen it already, fairly recently, I did a video where I broke down the actual case of Terry v. Ohio. I'm going to have it scroll across the screen up here. Pause this, give it a watch, and then come back and watch this. It'll put this into a little bit more context if you watch the video where I break down the actual case, because I'm not going to be talking about the case and the facts, just the legal requirements and a few other cases in this episode. I'm going to break this down into 3 steps, kind of the 3 basic steps that lay out the legal requirements of the Terry Frisk, and the step that we forget in the law enforcement community quite often. So let's get started here and talk about kind of Terry Frisks in general. Well, what are they? You all know kind of what they are, but how do they work? What are the legal requirements? So kind of in a nutshell, in Terry versus Ohio, the United States Supreme Court laid out the legal requirements for what we now call the Terry Frisk. So what are the kind of the basic, breaking it down, what do you got to have? The United States Supreme Court said when an officer has reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. So again, my first video, I go into more detail on that. When you have reasonable suspicion crime is afoot, you can temporarily detain someone to investigate, to dispel or confirm the suspicion that you have. All right, well, what about if you detain someone and they're a suspect in an armed robbery case? What if you detain someone and you know their criminal history and they're known to fight against the police? You can see a bulge in their clothing, they're messing with something. Well, the court said in that instance, not only can you detain them, but you can frisk them, a limited pat-down of the outer clothing to search for weapons or hard objects. When doing that search, you're limited to weapons or hard objects, but you may come across contraband. The court talks about what later develops the plain touch doctrine and how you can retrieve stuff that's not a weapon or a hard object, but it's very limited and it's very specific. So let's break it down. Like I said, 3 steps. Step 1, when we talk about a Terry Frisk, is just realizing when. When can you as a police officer conduct a Terry Frisk? Because this is mistake number 1 that I saw as a prosecutor. Some officers believe that they can conduct a Terry Frisk whenever they detain someone. That's not the case. Terry versus Ohio and Arizona versus Johnson. And by the way, every case I talk about, I think I'm going to talk about 3. Terry v. Ohio, Arizona versus Johnson, and Minnesota versus Dickerson. I'm going to leave a link in the description below in the podcast on YouTube. Check it out. I encourage you guys to read the case law. I'm just giving you the breakdown, the Reader's Digest, kind of cliff notes, but take a look at those cases because they're very important. So in Terry versus Ohio, and then later in Arizona versus Johnson, the Supreme Court reminded us that you can't automatically Terry Frisk people. It's a 2-step analysis. Step 1 being, obviously you have to have reasonable suspicion at the bare minimum to detain them, because if you're frisking them, it's a search and it's a seizure. So we have to be able to have a reason to make it reasonable under the Fourth Amendment to even do this, which is you got to have reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. That's step one. You can't just randomly Terry frisk someone. Step two, this is what officers forget sometimes. You do got reasonable suspicion to stop, to detain. In addition to that reasonable suspicion, officers must have reasonable suspicion that the person is presently armed and dangerous. So we need reasonable suspicion for the stop, plus reasonable suspicion that they're presently armed and dangerous. Arizona versus Johnson in 2009, the Supreme Court made that clear, reiterating what the court told us in Terry v. Ohio. Well, luckily, the courts have given us some guidance. Over the years, we have a number of factors that the courts have given to say these are things that you can look for as an officer that would give you reasonable suspicion that the person is presently armed and dangerous. Now, I'm not going to read to you an exhaustive list here, but these are the most common things that the courts have said that you can look for over the years. So, number one, past criminal history. So, are you dealing with someone that you've dealt with before? You know they have a violent history. They have convictions that involve weapons or crimes of violence. They have a history of fighting with officers. They have a history of carrying weapons, being dangerous, that sort of thing. You can use that history as a factor in building reasonable suspicion they're presently armed and dangerous. Association with gangs, reputation of being armed, being another one. One of the most common ones, do they have a bulge in their clothing that is consistent with where a weapon would be, what a weapon would look like? Furtive movements, that conclusion, I'm not a big fan of using that in your reports because remember, it's about facts. Facts are what lead to reasonable suspicion. What is the furtive movements? Are they adjusting stuff really quickly? As one student told me once, him being a concealed carry holder, how he'd always adjust his shirt when he'd get out of the car, and he noticed the suspect kept doing that as he was getting up and moving. Are they trying to hide something? Are the hands in the pockets and they're refusing to remove it? Those are the kind of things that you would look for to give you that, reasonable suspicion they're presently armed and dangerous. Other things include tips from a reliable confidential informant. What's the other big one that I'm missing here? The seriousness of the crime. The nature of the crime itself is probably one of the big ones. If you are detaining someone because you had a bolo and they match the description of someone involved in the armed robbery, well, an armed robbery means they were armed. So the type of crime is indicative of weapons being involved. A burglary, some other crime where you would expect a weapon to be involved, or as a dangerous crime. Those are the kind of factors you're looking for, and be specific. Remember, you're building reasonable suspicion. So that's the big one in step one, is just when can we do a Terry frisk? Because a lot of officers, they think it's automatic. It's not. You got to have reasonable suspicion to believe they're presently armed and dangerous. Another case to check out would be Ibarra versus Illinois, where officers executing a search warrant detained everyone on the premises and just searched everybody. They frisked everybody for no reason. And the court said, hey, you can't frisk this person unless you have reasonable suspicion they're presently armed and dangerous. All right, step number two. You know you can do a Terry frisk. You have factors that give you reasonable suspicion they're presently armed and dangerous. How do you conduct it? We're limited to outer clothing. This is a limited protective pat down of the outer clothing. That means you can't go inside pockets. I've seen us get in trouble where you're flipping the belts. Now, you get a little bit of leeway in the belt area, but we want to stay away from completely flipping that belt line over. You want to stick with that kind of Terry pat. You get a little bit of leeway there, but you don't want to go down to bare skin. What if they have big, heavy jackets on? Well, case law says you can remove it. You just don't go down to bare skin and start searching pockets and stuff like that. It's too intrusive. Remember, do the bare minimum that you need to be able to tell if they have a weapon or hard object, something that can be used as a weapon against you. Another question I get is, can you handcuff the suspect? And the answer is yes. The case law says you can. In fact, if you have reasonable suspicion to believe they're presently armed and dangerous, a court or a judge may expect that you would handcuff them. And by not doing so, it may indicate that you maybe didn't have the factor. So it depends on the way you do things, your policy, your procedure, your state law, but handcuffing is totally appropriate if the factors exist to justify it. But remember, we're limited to a brief pat down of outer clothing. Stay away from going inside pockets and stuff like that. All right, step three. What can you retrieve? When can you retrieve it? Well, as I mentioned, the Terry frisk, The legal requirement is it's designed for you to be safe as an officer, which means you're limited to a pat down and finding a weapon or hard object. So you are patting down and you feel something that feels like the receiver of a gun. All right, that's a hard object. It's consistent with a gun. You can go in now and retrieve it and take it out. Same thing with a hard object that could be consistent with a weapon. All right, what do you do if it's a soft object? This is where we get into the murkier waters here. If it's soft, you have to be careful not to manipulate the object, because remember, you're limited to weapons or hard objects. So the second you feel something that's not a weapon or a hard object, the courts will say it becomes unreasonable and intrusive if you continue to try to figure out what it is. However, the courts have given us the plain touch doctrine. So that's another case that you need to be familiar with, Minnesota versus Dickerson. In Minnesota versus Dickerson, officers had reasonable suspicion. The Supreme Court held they had reasonable suspicion to detain the suspect. It was in a high drug trafficking area. Those factors existed to give them the Terry Frisks. So they had step 1 and step 2. They had reasonable suspicion to detain. They had reasonable suspicion presently armed and dangerous. But the officer, as he was conducting the Terry Frisk, didn't find any weapons. And then at some point in the testimony said he knew he didn't have any weapons, but he felt a very small, soft object, which later turned out to be drugs wrapped in cellophane. That's not something that's a hard object. It's not consistent with being a weapon. The officer didn't know what it was. It testified that he had to continue to kind of manipulate it, and I can't remember the exact words of it. Testified, examined the lump with his fingers, and it slid, and it felt to be a lump of crack in cellophane. So the officer manipulated the soft object and then retrieved it. Now, the court in Minnesota versus Dickerson laid out an officer can retrieve something if the plain touch doctrine applies. In this case, the officer manipulated, didn't know what it was, so it was suppressed. So the rule from Dickerson was under the plain touch doctrine, okay? If you're doing your pat down for weapons, the second you touch that soft object, and you know it's not a weapon or hard object, without manipulating it, if it's immediately apparent to you that it's contraband, something illegal, drugs, then you can retrieve it. The key being it has to be immediately apparent with no manipulation. So obviously, if you're a more experienced officer, maybe you're on a drug task force, you know how drugs are packaged, you know exactly what it feels like, and the second you touch it, you recognize it, the plain touch doctrine would allow you to go and retrieve it, and it would be admissible. If you're a newer officer and you don't have that training experience, and you don't know what it is, and you're manipulating it, trying to figure it out, the plain touch doctrine doesn't apply. So, all right, that's kind of a really fast run through with that. But just make sure you understand the key thing here. Weapons are hard objects. If it's soft and it's not consistent with a weapon or hard object, you cannot manipulate it. But if you know the second you touch it, that it's contraband based on your training, your experience, whatever you can articulate, you know exactly what it is. As soon as you touch it, then you can retrieve it. But a lot of times the officers don't articulate that. They manipulate it. They pull it out. I've had a lot of drug cases suppressed where the officer felt the soft object. What is that? I'm not sure. They start messing with it. Oh, I bet that's crack. They reach in the pocket, pull it out. It's suppressed every time. So, all right, let's do a recap here on those 3 methods. Terry versus Ohio. It gives you as an officer a quick and limited search for weapons. You're limited to outer clothing. No going in the pockets. No bare skin. Outer clothing only. Weapons are hard objects. If it's a soft object and the incriminating nature is immediately apparent to you based on your training, your experience, then you can retrieve that object. If you don't know what it is, you can't get it. You may have to ask for consent, another exception to the warrant requirement, but you can't get it if it's a soft object and you don't know what it is without manipulating it. Also remember, if we're going to do the Terry Frisk, it's not automatic. You have to have reasonable suspicion to stop the person, plus reasonable suspicion they're presently armed and dangerous, and there's a number of factors that you can look at from the court. All right, that's a quick run through of this, just a barely under 15 minutes, which is kind of my rule in this podcast. It's a lot to cover. Like I said, make sure you go back and watch my video on Terry versus Ohio to get a little bit more insight on the breakdown of the case there. And make sure you hit the subscribe button. I couldn't cover everything. I'm going to do a part 2 where I talk about Terry frisking vehicles, Terry frisking backpacks, things that are in the immediate kind of lunging distance of the person, and what the rules are on that, because it's a little bit different. Make sure you subscribe. You'll get notified when I come out with that episode. If you're taking value from this and you want some more information about my search and seizure courses for police officers, go to my website at tacticalattorney.com. I'd love to come to your department and do my full in-depth search and seizure where I talk about Terry Frisks and every other topic under the Fourth Amendment. All right, that's all I got for you in this episode. Again, hit the subscribe button. I'm going to be coming out with a part 2 at some point in the near future. Until then, remember, every battle is won before it's fought. Please stay safe out there. I'll see you guys all in the next episode.